The note fractured mid-air when Eli Navarro asked his question. 400 people went silent under the Sonoma County Pavilion lights. The famous singer's smile stayed frozen. Stage lights burned hot against the 15-year-old's reflective volunteer vest. What he'd just exposed wasn't talent fraud. But what Eli didn't know was that his question had interrupted a 3-week investigation into charity fraud spanning 17 California counties' wildfire relief funds that never reached San Bernardino families. Scholarship money that vanished in Alameda County, 11 counties where the money simply disappeared. The volunteer coordinator who'd invited him to Sonoma. Part of a witness intimidation pattern documented across 3 states. Within 72 hours, his uncle's construction contract was terminated, his scholarship application rejected, citing pending legal considerations, and a Los Angeles law firm sent a letter about civil entanglements his family couldn't survive. Drop a comment where you're watching from, and subscribe before someone you trust becomes the person silencing you. Because Eli Navarro is about to decide whether testifying against multi-state fraud is worth losing everything his family has left. "Sing it again," Maribel Knox said into the microphone, already turning toward him as if the outcome were settled. Her smile, carrying the kind of certainty that came from 3 platinum albums and crowds that paid to watch her decide things. And this time, don't hide behind the crowd. The boy was standing where he shouldn't have been standing, under stage lights, hot enough that he could feel sweat forming along his hairline. The microphone clipped to his collar by someone who hadn't bothered asking his name. The open-air pavilion in Sonoma County smelled like crushed grass, and the particular sweetness of wine country dust mixing with evening air. The scent carrying through speaker towers that hummed with electrical charge even when nothing was playing through them. The band had stopped playing without being told to stop, instruments going silent mid-phrase, and the quiet spread faster than the sound system could catch it, rolling through the folding chairs and past the food stalls where people had been laughing 30 seconds earlier. Maribel smiled when she gave the order. The famous kind of smile people recognized from album covers, the kind that assumed permission had already been granted. The audience followed her gaze and found the boy thin, shoulders pulled inward, still wearing the reflective safety vest from the volunteer tent where he'd been sorting water bottles an hour before, the vest's fluorescent strips catching stage light in ways that made him more visible than he wanted to be. No one explained why he was there. No one needed to. The humiliation had already started. "Solo," she added, and the word bounced back half a second late through the speakers, louder than it should have been, the echo distorting slightly as it traveled across the pavilion. The boy didn't answer right away. He looked down at the wooden stage planks worn smooth from years of performances, then up at the lighting rig suspended overhead, then somewhere past the stage, as if checking for an exit he'd already known wasn't there. His name was Eli Navarro. He was 15. He'd taken a Greyhound from Fresno County that morning because the volunteer sign-up sheet said they needed extra hands for setup, and that was the only reason he'd come. He sang, not loudly, not carefully, just enough to fill the space she had carved out for him. The sound didn't wobble. It didn't rush. It climbed and settled in a way that made the laughter waiting for permission never arrive. Near the soundboard, someone froze with their hand mid-adjustment on a slider still warm from the previous song. At the edge of the stage, a man in a county-issued windbreaker lowered his clipboard without realizing he'd done it. Maribel laughed quickly, smoothing the moment over, praising courage and rawness and heart, gesturing for the band to come back in. The crowd exhaled, grateful to be told this was still entertainment. Eli didn't step back. He stayed where he was, hands shaking at his sides, in a way he could feel but couldn't control, staring past Maribel toward the stacked speaker towers. "Can you turn off whatever's helping the high part?" he asked, his voice barely carrying over the residual hum from the monitors. It wasn't defiant. That was why it landed. Maribel's laugh came again, sharper now, explaining arrangements and production realities and how touring actually worked if you understood the industry. She turned slightly, ready to dismiss him, ready to close the moment before it grew teeth. Subscribe before you miss the warning signs everyone else ignored. That's when the man in the windbreaker stepped forward, his shoes making soft sounds against the stage surface, clipboard still in his hand, his voice carrying the kind of procedural calm that didn't need a microphone. "We noted the same issue during rehearsal," he said evenly. "Multiple stops. The pavilion shifted in a way that had nothing to do with movement, the air thickening with the kind of tension that made the evening heat feel heavier than it had moments before." Maribel Knox kept her smile in place, the practiced kind that had survived worse moments than a county official with a clipboard, and she nodded graciously, as if this were all part of the show, as if she'd been planning to demonstrate her range anyway. She gestured to the sound engineer near the stage left tower, making a show of transparency, her hand movements deliberate enough to catch the fading sunlight that still colored the western edge of the pavilion. The crowd wanted to believe her. They needed to believe her, because the alternative meant they'd been paying for something that didn't exist, and that was harder to accept than a 15-year-old volunteer accidentally hitting notes in the right key. The support track muted with a click that traveled through the monitors, sudden enough that the silence felt physical. The band dropped out. The microphone went live with nothing behind it except Maribel Knox, and the promise she'd been selling for 3 albums and 17 California counties, the air carrying only the distant sound of traffic on the county road beyond the parking area and the rustle of people shifting in metal folding chairs that creaked under redistributed weight. She attempted the note. It arrived halfway, fractured early, collapsing inward before it could reach the height that had made her famous, leaving behind a space that had been sold as certainty for longer than Eli Navarro had been taking buses to volunteer events. The sound didn't fail dramatically. It just stopped being what it was supposed to be, and the silence that followed wasn't the kind that invited gasps or phone recordings. It was procedural, the way a document gets stamped or a form gets rejected, the kind of silence that belonged in offices where mistakes were catalogued without ceremony. No one cheered. A few people near the front shifted in their folding chairs, the metal on grass friction creating small sounds that felt too loud in the absence of music. The man in the windbreaker hadn't moved, his clipboard still held at the same angle, his expression unchanged. Maribel laughed again, quicker this time, explaining vocal fatigue and outdoor acoustics and how altitude could affect resonance even in Sonoma County, but the audience had already stopped listening the way they'd been listening before, and that was the part that couldn't be undone. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. The man stepped fully onto the stage apron, his shoes making deliberate contact with the wooden surface, and for the first time, someone near the soundboard called out asking who he was, the question cutting through the residual PA hum. That was when the windbreaker made sense in a way it hadn't before, when the official seal embroidered on the chest pocket became visible under the stage lights. Thomas Klein, California Attorney General's Charitable Trusts section, rotating through live events tied to public fundraising claims. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The title carried its own weight, the kind that turned entertainment into documentation and audiences into potential witnesses. The pavilion exhaled carefully, people exchanging glances that carried relief, mixed with secondhand embarrassment, the comfortable kind of scandal that came with clear boundaries and familiar shapes. A famous singer caught using studio tricks, a county official doing his job, a volunteer who'd accidentally revealed the truth. The story made sense. It fit. Phones stayed in pockets because this felt too small for recording, too ordinary for outrage. Eli Navarro stood exactly where he'd been standing when he'd asked his question, the reflective vest still catching stage light that had shifted from warm to cool as the sun dropped below the western hills. Watching Maribel Knox smooth her expression back into the version that appeared on album covers. The audience believed they understood what had just happened, a talent fraud exposed in real time, a clean reversal with a poor boy's unexpected competence on one side and a celebrity's manufactured image on the other, the kind of story that resolved itself in the moment it was revealed. They were wrong. What no one in that field knew not the crowd dispersing toward the parking area, where car doors were already slamming in the cooling evening air, or Maribel Knox conferring with her tour manager near the equipment trailers that smelled like diesel and compressed road dust, or Eli Navarro climbing back onto the volunteer shuttle with vinyl seats still warm from afternoon sun, was why Thomas Klein had been following the tour at all. 3 weeks earlier, in San Bernardino County, wildfire relief funds tied to Maribel's benefit performance had failed to reach the designated recovery accounts, the discrepancy appearing first as a clerical footnote in a quarterly audit before someone in the Attorney General's office noticed the pattern wasn't limited to one county or one oversight. In Alameda County, scholarship disbursements promised to students affected by the previous year's displacement had been delayed without explanation, the checks materializing weeks late in amounts that didn't match the promotional materials distributed at the Oakland Arena show. In Yavapai County, Arizona, a partner organization that had co-sponsored Maribel's Prescott Valley appearance quietly withdrew from the collaboration 3 days after the performance, citing undisclosed contractual complications that never made it past internal correspondence. The performances weren't just shows, they were leverage. Thomas Klein had been documenting the tour since Orange County, attending as credential verification rather than entertainment, watching the way funds moved through accounts with the same choreography Maribel used on stage, everything timed and rehearsed and dependent on audiences believing what they were told they were hearing. The vocal assistance wasn't the crime, it was the distraction. Every county that hosted a benefit concert received promotional assurances about fund allocation, transparency, and partnership accountability, language carefully worded to satisfy legal disclosure requirements, while leaving enough interpretive space that when the money arrived late or incomplete, or not at all, the explanations could be retrofitted to match whatever story the moment required. Monterey County had received 62% of projected scholarship funds. Santa Clara County's youth music program grants were still pending administrative review 4 months after the San Jose performance. The tour had crossed 17 California counties before reaching Sonoma, and in 11 of them, something hadn't added up. Eli Navarro hadn't uncovered fraud. He'd interrupted it. His question about the high note wasn't investigative. It was acoustic confusion from a 15-year-old who'd grown up singing in a church choir small enough that everyone could hear when someone went off-key, someone whose ear had been trained by necessity, rather than design in a sanctuary where the sound bounced off concrete walls and exposed any wavering pitch. But the question had forced a demonstration Thomas Klein had been trying to mandate through procedural channels for 2 weeks. And once the support track muted and the note failed in front of 400 witnesses under lights bright enough to prevent any claims about lighting conditions affecting what people saw and heard, the clean separation between talent fraud and financial fraud collapsed into a single evidentiary moment that would appear in depositions across 3 states. The audience had watched a singer fail to hit a note. What they'd actually witnessed was the mechanical failure of a system that had been designed to make verification impossible, and now the impossibility had a timestamp, and a location, and a boy in a reflective safety vest who hadn't understood what he was asking for. Subscribe so this doesn't happen unnoticed again. The consequences wouldn't arrive that night. They would wait, the way legal processes always waited, moving through jurisdictions with the same procedural efficiency Thomas Klein had used when stepping onto the stage. But the waiting had already started, and the boy on the shuttle back to the Greyhound station sitting against a window that vibrated with engine frequency, breathing air that smelled like exhaust and someone's leftover barbecue from the food stalls, had no way of knowing that his voice, the one that had climbed and settled without wobbling, had just made him the most inconvenient person in a case that had been building since wildfire smoke cleared from San Bernardino County and the relief funds never materialized. The story the audience believed they'd seen famous singer exposed, poor boy vindicated, justice served in real time was over before it started. The story that actually mattered was just beginning, and Eli Navarro was already inside it. The pavilion emptied the way. Outdoor venues always emptied after the final song didn't happen, people moving toward the parking area in clusters that suggested disappointment without requiring anyone to name it directly, their shoes crushing dried grass that released the smell of late-season growth mixed with spilled drinks from earlier in the evening. Conversations trailed off into speculations about refunds and whether the rest of the tour would continue or collapse under the weight of whatever had just been revealed on stage. Maribel Knox disappeared into one of the equipment trailers within minutes of Thomas Klein's introduction, the metal door slamming with a hollow sound that carried across the field. Her tour manager, forming a physical barrier between the trailer and the handful of local reporters who'd been covering the event as community interest rather than investigation. No statements were issued, no apologies were offered. The crew began breaking down the sound system with the efficient silence of people who'd learned not to ask questions when paychecks depended on discretion, cables coiling with practiced motions that made no unnecessary noise. Eli Navarro rode the volunteer shuttle back to the Greyhound station with 4 other people who'd spent the afternoon moving equipment and organizing crowd flow, the interior smelling like sunscreen and the particular must of air conditioning that hadn't been serviced in years. None of them spoke about what had happened on stage, because none of them understood what it meant beyond the obvious embarrassment of a singer who couldn't reproduce her own recorded vocals. The shuttle driver asked if anyone had gotten Maribel's autograph before things went sideways, and someone in the back row laughed in a way that didn't sound amused, breath fogging the window slightly in the cooling evening air. And that was the extent of the conversation. Eli pressed his forehead against the window glass, still warm from afternoon sun, and watched Sonoma County roll past in the early evening light. Vineyards, giving way to strip malls, and then to the transit station where the last southbound bus would leave in 40 minutes. He'd been gone from Fresno for 11 hours. He had homework due Monday that he hadn't started. The reflective safety vest was folded in his backpack along with the volunteer credential badge that no longer felt like something worth keeping. He thought the story was finished. In Clark County, Nevada, where Maribel's tour was scheduled to perform in 6 days, venue management received a call from the Attorney General's office requesting documentation of all charitable partnership agreements associated with the upcoming event, language polite enough to avoid sounding like a formal investigation, but specific enough that the venue's legal team understood cooperation wasn't optional. In Maricopa County, Arizona, accounts tied to Maribel's foundation were flagged for review, the kind of administrative hold that didn't make headlines but prevented fund transfers until compliance officers could verify disbursement protocols matched promotional claims. The tour's Iowa stop, scheduled for late October, received a quiet notification that logistical complications might require postponement, the explanation remaining vague in ways that suggested the complications weren't logistical at all. Subscribe before you miss what's happening in the spaces between headlines. None of this reached Eli, none of it needed to. He was sitting in an orange plastic chair at the Greyhound station, the molded surface still holding residual heat from passengers who'd occupied it earlier, eating a vending machine sandwich that tasted like preservatives and cardboard, checking the departure board to make sure his bus hadn't been delayed. His phone received a single text message from his uncle asking if he'd be home in time for dinner. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji and put the phone away, watching other travelers move through the station with the particular exhaustion that came from spending money on transportation rather than destinations. The evening felt ordinary, in the way endings were supposed to feel ordinary, everything returning to the shape it had been before a famous singer decided to make an example out of a volunteer who'd only asked a question because the sound hadn't made sense. By the time the bus pulled out of the station and merged onto Highway 101 southbound, its diesel engine creating a vibration that traveled through the seat frame into Eli's spine, Thomas Klein was already drafting the preliminary witness list that would eventually span 3 states and require testimony from venue staff, tour management, financial auditors, and one 15-year-old boy from Fresno County, whose auditory recognition had accidentally created an evidentiary record no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. The list remained internal. The investigation remained quiet. The consequences remained patient, moving through jurisdictions with the same procedural efficiency that had brought Thomas Klein to a Sonoma County pavilion on a Saturday evening when he could have been anywhere else. Eli fell asleep somewhere between San Jose and Gilroy, his head against the window glass that rattled slightly with road imperfections, the safety vest still folded in his backpack, the credential badge tucked into a pocket he'd forget to check until weeks later, when everything had already changed, and the question of whether to keep it or throw it away would carry weight he couldn't have anticipated on the night when keeping. It seemed like the only decision that mattered. Eli Navarro arrived back in Fresno County sometime after midnight, his uncle waiting in the apartment complex parking lot with the truck engine running because the ignition had been sticking lately, and turning it off meant risking whether it would start again, the idle creating a rough vibration that Eli could feel through the passenger door before he even opened it. They didn't talk about Sonoma on the drive to the apartment, his uncle asking only if Eli had eaten and whether the volunteer coordinators had been decent to work with, questions that suggested he'd heard something about what happened, but wasn't sure how to ask directly. Eli said the coordinators were fine and that he'd eaten a sandwich at the station, and that was enough conversation to carry them through the 15-minute drive to the complex off Highway 99, where they'd been living since Eli's mother passed during his sophomore year, and his uncle became his legal guardian by default rather than design. Monday arrived the way Mondays always arrived, with first-period biology and a quiz Eli had studied for on the bus ride home, the classroom smelling like the particular combination of old textbooks and floor cleaner that defined every science room he'd ever been in. His biology teacher handed back the quiz with a score that suggested studying on public transportation worked better than Eli had expected, and for approximately 2 hours that morning, everything felt like it was returning to the shape it had occupied before a famous singer decided to make him sing solo in front of 400 people. That feeling lasted until third period, when the front office sent a runner to pull Eli out of English class with instructions to bring his backpack and wait in the hallway outside the counselor's office, the corridor quiet enough that he could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He sat there for 40 minutes on a bench, with vinyl padding cracked enough to show the foam underneath, listening to voices behind the closed door that never quite rose loud enough to distinguish words, but carried the particular cadence of adults arguing about liability and exposure, and whether the district could be held responsible for student activities that occurred outside school jurisdiction. When the door finally opened, the principal gestured for Eli to go back to class without explaining what the meeting had been about, and Eli knew better than to ask questions that adults had already decided not to answer. Within 72 hours of the Sonoma incident, the consequences arrived in pieces, none of them dramatic enough to feel like punishment, but all of them precise enough to suggest coordination. His uncle's construction contract with the staging company that had hired temporary crew for the Sonoma event was terminated Wednesday morning with an email citing project completion and budget reallocation, in language so generic it could have meant anything, except that his uncle had been expecting 3 more weeks of work, and the termination came 2 days after Eli asked a question on stage. Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived from a Los Angeles County law firm on behalf of Knox Entertainment Management, the envelope heavy with the kind of paper stock that suggested legal importance, stating that Eli's presence during the performance had violated venue agreements and caused material disruption to contracted services, language that stopped short of threatening legal action while making clear that legal action remained available if circumstances required it. Friday morning brought a different kind of letter. This one from the Community Scholarship Fund his guidance counselor had encouraged him to apply for back in September, the kind of scholarship that covered books and supplies for students who maintained B averages and demonstrated financial need. The letter thanked Eli for his application and informed him that after careful review, The selection committee had decided to prioritize candidates whose circumstances didn't involve pending legal considerations that might complicate fund disbursement timelines. The language was careful. The meaning was clear. Someone had made a phone call. Someone had suggested that awarding a scholarship to Eli Navarro might create complications the fund couldn't afford to navigate. The volunteer credential badge he'd been wearing Saturday night was in his backpack that morning. By lunch period, he'd thrown it away in the cafeteria trash because keeping it felt like evidence of something he didn't understand yet, the metal edge catching the fluorescent light one last time before disappearing under crumpled napkins and half-eaten food. Friday afternoon, Eli's music teacher stopped him in the hallway between classes, a woman who'd taught choir for 20 years and had never spoken to Eli outside of attendance checks and concert logistics. She looked at him for a moment, long enough that Eli thought he was about to receive another warning about keeping his head down and avoiding complications the district couldn't afford. Instead, she said quietly, "I heard what you did. That took guts." And then she walked past him toward the faculty lounge before he could respond, her shoes making soft sounds against the polished linoleum. The moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. It didn't fix anything. It didn't change the termination letter or the law firm's language or the scholarship withdrawal. But it was the first time since Saturday that someone had acknowledged the question as something other than a problem. Subscribe before silence cost someone everything. By Friday evening, Eli was sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment off Highway 99. The law firm's letter unfolded in front of him next to his uncle's termination email, printed on paper that still smelled like the library printer he'd used because their apartment didn't have one. The scholarship rejection folded beside them like evidence of a pattern he was only beginning to recognize. His uncle was working a night shift at a different site, the kind of job that paid by the hour instead of by contract, and Eli was alone with the sound of traffic passing outside, and the understanding that everything that had happened in Sonoma County was supposed to be finished, but somehow wasn't. He was 15. He had school Monday. He lived in Fresno County, which meant traveling anywhere that might have answers required bus fare he didn't have, and permission his uncle couldn't give, without missing work they couldn't afford to lose. The consequences were supposed to make sense. They were supposed to connect to something he'd done wrong. But all he'd done was ask a question, and now he was sitting in an apartment that felt smaller than it had a week ago, trying to understand why asking had turned into evidence. The volunteer status that had gotten him to Sonoma in the first place was revoked without explanation, the email appearing in his school account Saturday morning with an automated signature and no contact information for appeals. Eli deleted it and then emptied the trash folder because keeping it felt like keeping the credential badge had felt, like holding on to proof of participation in something that had already decided he didn't belong. By day 6 after Sonoma, the isolation had settled into something Eli could recognize, even if he couldn't name it directly. It arrived in the spaces between normal things, in the way his uncle stopped mentioning job prospects during dinner, the forks scraping against ceramic plates that had belonged to Eli's mother, sounds louder in the absence of conversation, and started talking about weather instead, in the way the school counselor's door remained closed whenever Eli passed it in the hallway, the frosted glass window revealing only shadows of people who never emerged when he was present, in the way his phone stayed quiet except for automated reminders about assignments due and library books overdue. By the second week after Sonoma, Eli had learned to recognize the shape of being avoided without anyone admitting they were avoiding him, the particular silence that came from people who'd been told not to engage but hadn't been told why the engagement mattered enough to prohibit. The law firm's letter had used specific language, the kind that required reading twice to understand what it wasn't saying directly, the heavy paper stock carrying an ink smell that reminded Eli of the county offices his mother used to drag him through when she was dealing with benefit paperwork, material disruption, contractual obligations, potential civil entanglements. The words suggested consequences without naming them, implied liability without defining it, created a framework where cooperation could trigger complications. The letter never specified, but Eli's uncle understood immediately because he'd spent 20 years working jobs where reading between lines was more important than reading contracts. The termination email from the staging company hadn't mentioned Eli's name. It hadn't needed to. The timing was explanation enough, and the timing told a story about cause and effect that didn't require documentation to be understood by anyone who'd ever lost work for reasons that couldn't be written down. What Eli didn't know, sitting at the kitchen table that second Friday after Sonoma with homework, he couldn't concentrate on spread across the surface his uncle had cleared. After dinner, the formica scratched in patterns that suggested years of use. Cool under his palms was that the pressure wasn't random. It was architectural. In Orange County, another volunteer who'd worked the sound check for Maribel's earlier performance had been contacted by venue management about potential testimony regarding audio equipment configurations, a conversation that lasted approximately 6 minutes before the volunteer's parents received notification that their son's involvement might complicate pending scholarship applications if legal proceedings required depositions that conflicted with academic schedules. The volunteer declined to participate. The scholarship applications proceeded without complication. The pattern was documented in Thomas Klein's files under witness coordination issues, language neutral enough to survive administrative review while meaning exactly what it appeared to mean. Subscribe before the pattern repeats, and you become the next name on the list. Eli was being isolated because he was a witness, not because he'd embarrassed a celebrity. The distinction mattered in ways he wouldn't understand until later, when the difference between being punished for disruption and being silenced for verification became the only thing separating testimony from capitulation. The staging company termination, the school administrator meeting, the law firm letter, the scholarship withdrawal, none of it was retribution. It was containment. Every consequence had been designed to communicate a single message without stating it explicitly. Cooperation would cost more than silence, and the costs would arrive in forms that couldn't be challenged because they'd never be acknowledged as connected to anything that happened in Sonoma County. His uncle came home from the night shift sometime after 2 a.m, moving quietly through the apartment because he thought Eli was asleep, his work boots making soft sounds against the linoleum that was peeling slightly near the threshold. But Eli was still at the kitchen table with the law firm letter unfolded next to his biology textbook, both documents requiring attention he couldn't sustain. His uncle stood in the doorway for a moment, still wearing his work boots because taking them off meant admitting the shift was finished, and the next one would start in 8 hours, the smell of construction dust and diesel clinging to his clothes. He looked at the letter, then at Eli, then back at the letter. "They told you cooperation could trigger civil entanglements?" his uncle asked, not sitting down, not moving closer, just standing there in the doorway with the hallway light behind him, creating a silhouette that made it hard to see his expression. Eli nodded. "That's not about you embarrassing her," his uncle said quietly. "That's about you seeing something they don't want verified." The apartment was silent except for the refrigerator motorcycling with a slight rattle that meant the compressor was wearing out, and traffic passing on Highway 99, the same sounds that had filled the background of every conversation they'd had since Eli moved in 3 years ago. Sounds so constant they'd stopped being noticeable, until moments like this, when everything else went quiet enough that the baseline hum became the only thing left. His uncle sat down finally, pulled the letter across the table, read it again even though he'd already read it twice before, looking for language that might have changed between readings, his calloused fingers leaving slight marks on the heavy paper. "You're not being punished," his uncle said. "You're being warned." That was when Eli understood that everything he'd thought was finished in Sonoma County had actually been starting, and the question he'd asked about the high note hadn't been a question at all. It had been a designation. He was a witness now, whether he wanted to be or not, and the consequences weren't designed to hurt him. They were designed to make him disappear before anyone asked him to verify what his voice had already confirmed on stage, in front of 400 people who'd thought they were watching entertainment instead of documentation. The volunteer status revocation, the contract termination, the school's liability concerns, the law firm's carefully worded implications, the scholarship that had been withdrawn with language about pending legal considerations. None of it was about what Eli had done. All of it was about what he might say if someone asked him to say it again, officially, in a context where his answer would become part of a record that couldn't be smoothed over with explanations about touring realities and acoustic complications. For the first time since Saturday night in Sonoma County, Eli wished he had stepped back when Maribel Knox told him to sing solo, wished he'd stayed in the volunteer tent where questions didn't echo through sound systems and turn into evidence, wished he'd never noticed that the high note didn't sound right, because noticing had turned into verification, and verification had turned into something that required isolation to contain. But wishing didn't change the letter on the table, or the termination in his uncle's email, or the scholarship rejection, or the understanding that silence had become the only currency that mattered in a transaction Eli hadn't agreed to participate in. The investigation expanded in ways Eli only learned about through fragments, pieces of information that arrived disconnected from each other like puzzle sections from different boxes that somehow belonged to the same image. His uncle heard from a former staging crew supervisor over coffee that smelled burnt because the diner's machine hadn't been cleaned in weeks. The acrid scent mixing with diesel exhaust from the truck stop across the street, that the Nevada dates had been postponed indefinitely, not canceled, but suspended pending venue compliance reviews, that nobody could explain in detail without referencing confidentiality clauses. Someone in Eli's history class mentioned seeing a news brief about charity audit irregularities tied to touring performances, the kind of story that appeared in the local section and disappeared by the next news cycle because nobody important enough to matter had been formally charged with anything specific enough to generate sustained attention. What Eli couldn't see from his apartment off Highway 99 was the machinery moving through jurisdictions with the procedural efficiency of systems designed to operate whether or not the people affected by them understood what was happening. In Clark County, Nevada, subpoenas were drafted requesting documentation of all charitable partnerships associated with Maribel Knox's scheduled performance at a venue that had already begun refunding ticket purchases under the explanation of scheduling conflicts. In Maricopa County, Arizona, accounts tied to Knox Entertainment Management remained frozen pending compliance verification, the holds extending beyond initial 30-day review periods into timelines that suggested the complications weren't administrative oversights. The Iowa performance that had been scheduled for late October was formally canceled in early November. The announcement citing logistical challenges that became less vague when venue management quietly informed local media that insurance complications related to pending legal reviews had made the performance impossible to guarantee. The tour hadn't collapsed. It had been systematically dismantled across state lines by processes Eli would never witness, and decisions made in offices he would never enter, by people whose names he would never learn. All of it connected to a question he'd asked because the high note didn't sound right, and he hadn't known enough to understand that noticing was dangerous. 2 weeks after Sonoma, Eli was helping his uncle sort through mail at the kitchen table, envelopes creating small, paper-sliding sounds against the Formica surface, when he found a newsletter from a Fresno County community organization his mother had volunteered with before she passed. One of those printed updates that arrived quarterly whether anyone read them or not, the paper carrying the particular smell of bulk mail facilities. The November issue included a brief notice about delayed wildfire relief fund disbursements from the previous year, money that had been promised through benefit concert partnerships but remained pending allocation review due to documentation inconsistencies. The notice didn't mention Maribel Knox by name. It didn't need to. Eli remembered his mother talking about the benefit concert at the Fresno Convention Center back when the smoke was still clearing from the Creek fire. remembered her saying that at least something good could come from the disaster if the funds actually reached the families who'd lost everything. The funds hadn't reached those families, not all of them, not in the amounts that had been promised. Subscribe before this happens in your county without anyone noticing. Eli sat at the table with the newsletter open to the page that explained the delay in language carefully designed not to blame anyone specifically, the cheap ink leaving slight residue on his fingers, and for the first time since Sonoma, he understood that the fraud wasn't abstract. It wasn't just about scholarship money in counties he'd never visited, or partnership agreements in states he'd never seen. It was about his neighbors, people his mother had known, families who'd been counting on money that Maribel Knox's foundation had collected, and then failed to distribute in ways that matched the promotional materials that had accompanied the Fresno performance. The performance had happened before Eli started paying attention to benefit concerts. The delays had started after the performance ended, and the attention moved to the next county and the next show. His question in Sonoma hadn't just interrupted a pattern. It had exposed a pattern that had already touched Fresno County, which meant it had touched people Eli's mother would have cared about protecting, which meant the silence everyone was pressuring him toward wasn't just about avoiding civil entanglements his family couldn't afford. It was about allowing something to continue that had already affected his own community, while everyone looked the other way, because looking directly required verification nobody wanted to provide. That same week, a different kind of pressure emerged. His uncle received a call from a former employer in Kern County, offering steady work that would require relocating south to Bakersfield, the timing convenient enough to feel orchestrated. The offer was legitimate. The pay was better than what his uncle was currently making on hourly jobs, but it would mean pulling Eli out of school mid-semester, leaving Fresno County before any potential testimony could be scheduled, creating geographic distance that would complicate witness coordination without requiring anyone to explicitly suggest that avoiding testimony was the purpose. His uncle didn't accept the offer immediately. He didn't decline it either. The possibility sat there like another consequence, another cost attached to a question Eli had asked because the high note didn't sound right. The newsletter stayed on the table for 3 days, neither Eli nor his uncle mentioning it directly, but both of them aware it was there, the paper curling slightly at the edges from kitchen humidity, a physical reminder that the consequences of silence weren't theoretical. They were specific. They had addresses in Fresno County and names his mother would have recognized and losses that couldn't be recovered if the investigation weakened because witnesses disappeared before they could verify what they'd already seen. Eli still didn't know what he was supposed to do with the information, but he knew now that doing nothing meant the pattern would continue, and continuing meant other counties would receive the same carefully worded newsletters explaining delays that would never be fully resolved, because the system that created them was designed to make resolution impossible without witnesses, willing to verify what everyone already suspected, but nobody could prove without someone stepping forward to say it officially. The isolation intensified. The pressure remained constant, but the understanding of what the pressure was protecting had shifted from abstract liability to concrete loss, and that shift changed the shape of the choice Eli hadn't yet been asked to make but knew was coming, eventually, inevitably, with the same procedural certainty that had brought subpoenas to Clark County and account freezes to Maricopa County and cancellations to Iowa, venues that had done nothing wrong except host performances connected to a system that had been operating successfully until a 15-year-old volunteer noticed that the high note didn't sound right. Thomas Klein called on a Tuesday evening in late November, 3 weeks after the Sonoma Pavilion, his voice carrying the same procedural calm it had carried when he stepped onto the stage, no introduction beyond his name, because he assumed Eli would remember who he was and what he represented. The phone felt warm against Eli's ear from being in his pocket all day, and he could hear the faint hum of what sounded like office air conditioning on Klein's end, suggesting the call was coming from somewhere official rather than personal. The call lasted 11 minutes. Klein didn't apologize for the pressure Eli's family had been experiencing. He didn't offer reassurance that things would improve or promises that cooperation would be protected. He explained options, the way someone might explain highway directions, factual and direct, and stripped of comfort. Testify at the hearing scheduled for early December, spanning California and Nevada and Arizona jurisdictions, and provide verification of what happened on stage regarding the vocal assistants and the question Eli had asked and the demonstration that followed. The testimony would become part of a formal record. It would strengthen the investigation's ability to pursue felony fraud charges instead of misdemeanor violations. It would make fund recovery possible for wildfire victims and scholarship recipients and partnership organizations that had been promised money that never fully materialized. It would also expose Eli to civil liability his family couldn't afford, place him in depositions he had no experience navigating, and potentially trigger exactly the entanglements the Los Angeles County law firm had warned about in language designed to avoid calling them threats or decline to participate. The investigation would continue with the documentation already gathered, but without Eli's testimony, the case would weaken in ways that mattered legally, even if they didn't matter practically. Misdemeanor charges could be pursued, fines could be levied. But fund recovery became complicated without witness verification, and felony prosecution required evidence that couldn't be challenged on technical grounds, which meant it required someone who'd been present and paying attention and asking questions they hadn't been coached to ask. There would be no witness protection program, no relocation assistance, no guarantee that cooperation would shield Eli or his uncle from the consequences the law firm had implied and the staging company had demonstrated, and the school administrators had discussed behind closed doors. Eli wasn't supposed to hear through. Just a record of what happened and consequences that would arrive quietly, the way consequences always arrived for people who verified things powerful entities preferred to keep unverified. Klein explained all of this without emotion, not because he didn't care, but because caring wouldn't change the options, or make the choice easier, or protect Eli from what either decision would cost. When he finished, he asked if Eli had questions. Eli asked how many other witnesses were participating. Klein paused long enough that the silence became its own answer, the office hum on his end, suddenly more noticeable in the absence of words, then said that witness coordination remained under review, which was the professional way of saying that other people who'd seen what Eli had seen had already decided that silence was safer than verification. Subscribe before someone you trust becomes the person you should fear. After the call ended, Eli sat at the kitchen table, listening to traffic pass on Highway 99. The distinctive sound of semi-trucks downshifting as they approached the off-ramp, creating a pattern he'd learned to recognize without thinking about it, the same sounds that had filled the background of every significant conversation he'd had since moving into the apartment 3 years earlier. His uncle was working another night shift, the kind that paid hourly and ended whenever the work was finished, which meant Eli was alone with the choice Klein had presented and the understanding that both options led to costs his family couldn't absorb but would be required to pay regardless of which direction he chose. He thought about the microphone in Sonoma County, the one that had been clipped to his collar by someone who hadn't asked his name, about how small the moment had felt when he asked about the high note and how large it had become afterward. He thought about his mother, who would have known the families waiting for wildfire relief funds that matched the donation totals they'd been promised, who would have cared whether they received what they'd been told they would receive. He thought about the volunteer from Orange County who declined to participate and watched his scholarship applications proceed without complication, about the pattern Klein had documented and the system that had been designed to make verification dangerous enough that most people chose silence, because silence was survival. For weeks, Eli had been wishing he'd stepped back when Maribel Knox told him to sing solo, wishing he'd stayed quiet when the high note didn't sound right, wishing he'd never asked the question that turned him into a witness. But sitting alone in the apartment with the traffic noise and the kitchen light that hummed slightly with electrical interference, and the understanding that declining meant the fraud would continue in other counties with other families, who'd receive carefully worded newsletters about delays that would never resolve, Eli stopped wishing he'd been silent. He didn't want to testify. He didn't want the civil liability or the depositions or the entanglements the law firm had implied. But he also didn't want to be the reason the investigation weakened and fund recovery became impossible, and families in Fresno County and San Bernardino County and Alameda County continued waiting for money that would never arrive because nobody was willing to verify what everyone already knew. It wasn't heroic resolve. It was just refusal to be erased. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from Thursday. Klein had said Eli could take time to decide, but the deadline for confirming participation was Friday morning, which meant Eli had 72 hours to choose between costs he couldn't afford and silence he couldn't justify. The deadline approaching with the same mechanical inevitability as the traffic outside that never stopped, regardless of what anyone inside the apartment decided. He sat at the table until after midnight, the phone dark on the surface next to the newsletter that explained delays in language designed not to blame anyone, both objects carrying weight beyond their physical mass, and he didn't wish anymore that he'd stayed in the volunteer tent where questions didn't echo and turn into evidence. He just wished the choice was different. But wishing didn't change options, and the deadline was coming whether he was ready or not. The hearing was scheduled across 3 jurisdictions because the fraud had crossed 3 state lines, California and Nevada and Arizona, maintaining separate proceedings that would be coordinated through shared evidence, pools, and witness testimony that couldn't be duplicated without creating inconsistencies. Prosecutors would spend months trying to reconcile. Eli would be required to appear in Sacramento County first, where the California Attorney General's office had consolidated the state-level charges, the courtroom likely smelling like old wood paneling and recycled air like every government building he'd ever been in, then provide depositions for Nevada and Arizona proceedings that would reference the California testimony without requiring him to travel to Clark County or Maricopa County, unless the defense challenged his statements in ways that demanded cross-examination. The logistics were complicated enough that Thomas Klein sent a follow-up email Wednesday afternoon outlining the schedule and the travel arrangements and the timeline Eli would need to commit to if he chose to participate, all of it contingent on confirmation by Friday morning, the email notification making his phone vibrate against the kitchen table with a small rattling sound. Without Eli's testimony, the investigation could pursue misdemeanor charges based on documentation, irregularities, and partnership agreement violations, the kind of charges that resulted in fines Maribel Knox's legal team could negotiate down to amounts that wouldn't require asset liquidation or tour cancellations beyond what had already occurred. The fines would be paid. The case would close. The fund recovery process would become complicated enough that most recipient organizations would accept partial disbursements rather than continue fighting for full amounts through civil litigation they couldn't afford to sustain. The pattern would be noted in regulatory filings. The consequences would be financial, but not criminal. And families in Fresno County and San Bernardino County and Alameda County would continue waiting for relief funds that would eventually arrive in reduced amounts, with explanations about administrative costs and legal fees, and settlement negotiations that had required compromises nobody was happy about, but everyone had agreed to accept. With Eli's testimony, the investigation could pursue felony fraud charges across multiple jurisdictions, the kind of charges that carried prison sentences and asset freezes and mandatory restitution that couldn't be negotiated away through settlement agreements. Fund recovery would become possible in full amounts because felony convictions created enforcement mechanisms that didn't exist in misdemeanor resolutions. Scholarship recipients would receive what they'd been promised. Wildfire victims would get relief funds that matched donation totals. Partnership organizations would be made whole. But Eli would face civil liability exposure his family couldn't survive, depositions that would require missing school for weeks, and legal entanglements that the Los Angeles County law firm had already warned about in language designed to communicate consequences without making threats that could be documented. The choice wasn't between right and wrong. It was between two versions of wrong that would cost different people in different ways, and Eli was the only one who could decide which costs mattered more. Subscribe so this doesn't happen unnoticed again. Thursday evening, Eli sat at the kitchen table with the email from Thomas Klein open on his phone, the screen's blue light creating a slight glow on the scratched Formica surface. The logistics section, outlining travel dates and hearing schedules and deposition timelines that assumed participation Eli hadn't confirmed. His uncle was home for once, sitting across from him drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, the ceramic mug making a dull sound when he set it down. Neither of them talking because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in the 11-minute phone call and the 3 days of silence that followed. The deadline was tomorrow morning. Klein needed confirmation by 9 o'clock Pacific time, so the Sacramento proceedings could finalize witness lists, and the Nevada and Arizona offices could coordinate their deposition schedules. Eli hadn't answered. He'd read the email 4 times. He'd looked at the newsletter about Fresno County fund delays. He'd thought about his mother and the families she would have wanted protected, and the volunteer from Orange County who'd chosen silence and watched his scholarship applications proceed without complication. He'd thought about the law firm's letter and his uncle's terminated contract, and the school administrators discussing liability behind a closed door he wasn't supposed to hear through. The hearing would happen with or without him. The investigation would continue regardless. But the outcome would change based on whether Eli verified what he'd already seen, and verification meant stepping forward again in a context where stepping forward would cost more than it had the first time, when all he'd done was ask a question because the high note didn't sound right, and he hadn't known that noticing would turn into evidence that would follow him from Sonoma County to Sacramento County to wherever the depositions would eventually require him to travel. His uncle looked at him across the table, the cold coffee still in his hands, condensation forming on the outside of the mug despite the liquid being hours old, and asked quietly if Eli knew what he was going to do. Eli said he didn't. His uncle nodded, set the coffee down with a soft ceramic on Formica click, and told him that whatever he decided would be the right choice, because it would be his choice, which was the kind of thing adults said when they didn't know how to make the decision any easier, but wanted to acknowledge that the decision mattered. The deadline was tomorrow morning. The hearing was 2 weeks from Thursday, and Eli still hadn't decided whether verification was worth what it would cost, or whether silence was survivable knowing what it would allow to continue. Thursday became Friday sometime around 2 in the morning, the kitchen clock on the stove clicking over from 1:59 to 2 with the small mechanical sound that only registered when everything else had gone quiet enough to notice. Eli was still at the table, the same Formica surface his uncle had cleared after dinner 6 hours earlier, scratched along the edges from years of use that predated their tenancy in the apartment off Highway 99. The law firm's letter was unfolded in front of him, the paper heavy in the way official documents were always heavy. Substantial enough to suggest importance, even when the words printed on it communicated threats without calling them threats. His phone was face down next to the letter, the screen dark because he'd stopped checking it. After the 4th time, he read Thomas Klein's email, outlining logistics that assumed participation Eli hadn't confirmed. The window above the sink was open half an inch, letting in November air that carried the smell of diesel exhaust and fast food from the truck stop 2 blocks south, the particular combination of scents that meant Highway 99 at night, when the long-haul routes were active and the traffic never fully stopped. A semi passed, its engine compression brake rattling the window frame in a way that made the glass vibrate without breaking, the sound trailing off as the truck merged back into the southbound lane, toward Bakersfield or Los Angeles, or wherever freight needed to arrive by morning. The overhead fluorescent light had started flickering around midnight, the bulb reaching the end of its lifespan but not quite ready to fail completely, creating a rhythm of brightness and shadow that made reading difficult but wasn't irritating enough to justify getting up and replacing it. Eli's coffee had gone cold in the mug. his uncle had given him 3 Christmases ago, the ceramic still holding residual warmth, but no longer hot enough to justify drinking, the surface showing the film that formed when coffee sat too long without being finished. He didn't remember making the coffee. He didn't remember deciding to stay awake past midnight or past 1 o'clock, or into the hours when the only people still conscious were working night shifts, or avoiding decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. The deadline was Friday morning at 9. Klein needed confirmation so the Sacramento proceedings could finalize witness lists. The hearing was 2 weeks from Thursday. And Eli still hadn't decided whether to verify what he'd already seen or let the investigation weaken without him. He thought about the microphone in Sonoma County, the one that had been clipped to his collar by someone who hadn't asked his name, about how small the moment had felt when he asked about the high note and how large it had become afterward. Subscribe before the microphone finds you and you're not ready. He thought about his mother, who would have cared about the families waiting for wildfire relief funds that matched the donation totals they'd been promised. He thought about the volunteer from Orange County who'd chosen silence and proceeded with his life uninterrupted, and about the law firm's letter explaining civil entanglements in language designed to communicate danger without documentation. The traffic on Highway 99 continued outside, constant and indifferent. The same rhythm that had filled the background of every significant moment Eli had experienced since moving into the apartment 3 years earlier. His uncle was asleep in the other room, or pretending to be asleep because sleep was easier than sitting at the table watching Eli try to make a choice that would cost something regardless of which direction he chose. The fluorescent light flickered, the coffee stayed cold, the letter remained unfolded, and the phone screen stayed dark because turning it on meant reading Klein's email again and confronting logistics that required an answer Eli didn't have. The microphone was waiting, not the physical one from Sonoma County, but the metaphorical one that existed in Sacramento County, courtrooms and Nevada depositions, and Arizona proceedings where verification would be required, and witnesses would step forward or decline to step forward, and the outcome would change based on who was willing to speak and who chose silence, because silence was safer than the alternative. Eli had 13 days before the hearing. He had 7 hours before the deadline. And he had a kitchen table in Fresno County, and a question that had turned into evidence, and a choice that would follow him whether he testified or declined, whether he verified what everyone already suspected or let the investigation proceed without the confirmation prosecutors needed to pursue felony charges that would make fund recovery possible for families his mother would have wanted. Protected. The deadline was tomorrow morning. The microphone was waiting. And Eli Navarro, 15 years old, sitting alone in an apartment that smelled like diesel and cold coffee and November air from Highway 99, still hadn't decided if he would answer when it called his name again.